on where you are. My name is Marina Finken, and I am the Making Finance Work for Africa Partnership Coordinator. On behalf of the partners gathered here today, the Global Center of Adaptation, the Making Finance Work for Africa Secretariat, the African Development Bank, UNEP-FI, and the African Financial Alliance on Climate Change that you will be presented today, I want to wish you a very warm welcome and thank you for joining us today. We are very delighted to see so many of you for this webinar on what the climate change means for the African financial sector. This is the first of a series of webinars to discuss the impact of climate change on Africa's financial sector. So let me quickly remind you some housekeeping rules. As you may have noticed, your microphone are disabled, and we will ask you to keep them so for the entire webinar. You will have the opportunity to ask questions on the presentation, either by using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom or by raising your hand. You can listen into the presentation either in French or in English. You can make the choice using the interpretation or translation button at the bottom of your screen. As usual, we will share with you the recording and the slides of the presentation within 72 hours following the webinar. And please, last but not least, please do not forget to complete the questionnaire, which will appear automatically on the screen at the end of the discussion. It's very valuable to us as it will help us to getting better and provide you with better services. Now, if we move to the next slide, let me take some minutes to welcome and also thank our speakers today. Professor Anthony Nyong will give us some opening remarks shortly, Director of Climate Change and the Green Growth at the African Development Bank. Paul Smith, leader of the Climate Adaptation and Physical Risk Work at the UNEP-FI, will give you some insights on this crucial question: what does the climate change mean for the African financial sector? David Ashekbar, Chief Financial Sector Strategy Officer within the African Development Bank, will present us the Aflac initiative. If we move to the next slide, you will see the outline of the session. So we will be together for approximately 1 hour. And without further ado, I will pass the floor now to Professor Anthony Nyong for some opening remarks. Professor Anthony Nyong, thank you again for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Marina. Thank you, dear financial sector executives, our partner institutions within the African Financial Alliance on Climate Change, the African Development Bank staff, colleagues, and others from other development organizations that have joined us here today. You're welcome. And so on behalf of the African Development Bank Group, I thank you all for honoring our invitation to the first of a series of webinars on climate change and the African financial sector. I take this opportunity to thank colleagues from the African Development Bank, especially from the Climate Change and Green Growth Department and the Financial Sectors Department, the Secretariat for Making Finance Work for Africa, the Global Center on Adaptation, and UNEP-FI for organizing this very important event. Climate change, we know, is an existential threat. Many of us have personally experienced its effects in the increased frequency and intensity of extreme events such as floods, droughts, cyclones, or the outbreak of pests and diseases like the desert locust that ravaged East Africa 2 years ago. I'm glad that the presentations today will throw more light on these impacts and how the financial sector is not immune. Africa has no choice but to adapt to climate change, even though we are the least contributor to the phenomenon. To support the continent in adapting, the African Development Bank has committed to invest about $25 billion in 5 years, with 50% of that going towards adaptation, as requested by the UN, particularly the UN Secretary General. We have reached this. We have achieved the 50% parity, and we have exceeded that because that is the need of our dear continent. But while the initiatives by the African Development Bank Group are significant and encouraging, the continent has investment opportunities of about $2 to $3 trillion between 2020 and 2030 to implement the continent's climate commitments. This presents a significant investment opportunity for the financial industry. I've always stated that when a particular country or the continent says we've developed our nationally determined contributions, and they have listed and stated how much it will take to do that, that's an investment opportunity because somebody will need to invest to ensure that those commitments are met. Africa's financial sector can and should take advantage of the opportunities to redirect their investments to support the building of low carbon and climate resilient economy, as well as build their own resilience to climatic shocks. The African financial sector needs support at all levels to understand and manage climate risks effectively and offer products enabling the real sector to take full advantage of climate adaptation and mitigation opportunities. So ladies and gentlemen, it is for these reasons that the African Development Bank set up the African Financial Alliance on Climate Change, popularly called Aflac, in the year 2018. The African Financial Alliance on Climate Change is a platform for Africa's financial sector that seeks to de-risk and direct capital flows towards low carbon and climate resilient investments on the continent. Aflac complements initiatives with similar objectives but focused on the global level. Fundamentally, Aflac aims to ensure that the voice of Africa's financial sector is heard in the evolving international discourse on climate change. Let me reiterate that the financial relevance of climate change is beyond doubt. That is why we developed this webinar series on climate change and the financial sector with our partners. The series aims to foster a shared understanding of the issues at the intersection of climate change and finance. I recall several years ago when we had just started Aflac, and I needed to attend a meeting of leaders in Africa's banking sector. And when I talked about climate change, the initial reaction then was, what are you talking about? We're here doing something very serious. This is about the economy and not. But gradually, that is changing because we're seeing the direct impacts of climate change on the banks, their balance sheets, and their investments. So this is extremely very important. So like we've said, today's webinar is the first in this 5-part series. During this session, we hope all participants will develop a better understanding of climate change, its broad implications for the financial sector, and how Africa's financial industry can facilitate a low carbon and climate resilient future for the African continent. Finally, I wish to invite the financial industry associations represented here to join and participate in the working groups for banks, insurance, capital markets, and institutional investors in the structure of Aflac. That you are going to see today, and I look forward to a very important and rich deliberation. I thank you for your kind attention. Marina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Nyong, and thank you for setting up the tone for this very first webinar. And indeed, the one of the main expectations is to provide with the participants here a better understanding of the impact of climate change of the financial sector. So we have Paul Smith here from UNEP-FI, which will give you some insights and some elements of understanding on the impact that Professor Nyong just mentioned of the climate change on the financial sector. Paul, the floor is here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Marina, and good afternoon, good morning, everybody, and many thanks to Anthony for his opening introduction, and also to Stefan, David, and Marina from the African Development Bank, and Sandy from the Global Center on Adaptation and their teams for arranging this seminar. My name is Paul Smith. I think I've already been introduced. I'm in the climate team at the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, UNEP-FI, working mainly on climate adaptation and physical risks, as well as supporting our regional team in the Middle East and North Africa. And my colleague, Noor Natef, covers both Africa and the Middle East, and is also on board to respond to any sort of questions around what we do in those regions as well. So next slide, please. Yes, so the agenda for today is really in 4 parts. Well, the agenda for my mini presentation. First of all, we'll be looking just very briefly at the climate impacts and future scenarios in Africa. Then global climate finance trends and what that means for Africa. And then what is actually happening on the continent in terms of the finance sector's response. And then, because I represent UNEP-FI, what we are doing to support that work. Just as an advance warning, my slides are fairly comprehensive, so just for your benefit and not to make you suffer too much, I won't be reading everything out on the slides. They're really more of a resource for you to take away. And I will be providing an overview of what we're going through today. So, and in terms of timing, Marina, if you want to interrupt me when we get towards the end, please do so. Next slide, please. Okay, so first of all, the impacts on Africa, most of the references I'll be taking to discuss the impacts on the continent will be taken from the IPCC's 6th assessment report. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, was formed in 1988 by the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environment Programme, which I represent, as an independent panel of scientists and experts supported by 195 member states of the United Nations. Since 1988, the IPCC has completed 6 assessment cycles, with the latest culminating this year. The 6th assessment report, which I will be mostly looking at during this presentation, or the first part of this presentation, marks the culmination of this 6th assessment cycle and consists of 3 reports focusing on the 3 working groups of the IPCC, as well as 1 synthesis report, which was released around 1.5 to 2 months ago. I'll be focusing largely on the work of the first 2 working groups. So that is the physical science basis, in other words, what is happening with the climate and how it will evolve over the coming century. And the report published by Working Group 2, which looks at how ecosystems and human systems are responding to a changing climate and will respond in the future, the vulnerabilities of these systems and their capacities and limits to adapt to climate change. Just as a final word, the 6th assessment cycle also included 3 special reports, including the first look at how we could, what would be the impacts and how we could move towards a climate pathway of only 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. And the 2 other reports looked at land use and climate change and the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. So the IPCC does have a remit to look at specific aspects of climate change. Next slide, please. So in terms of the global impacts, the 6th assessment report gave a stark warning of the potentially catastrophic changes to come. And there is a need for urgent action. The sort of 3 headline things that I want to underline is that it's the first assessment report that unequivocally links human activities to a heating climate. It also underlines that global warming is very likely to surpass 2 degrees Celsius without rapid emissions reductions, and that in the high emissions scenario, which if we do very little or continue on our current course, will head towards between 3 degrees and almost 6 degrees of warming, and the catastrophic impacts that implies. Impacts are global, so there will be temperature increases throughout the world on land and ocean. Hot extremes should be expected in all inhabited regions. Heavy precipitation increases will be expected in most regions, or in several regions, I'm sorry. And in many other regions, they will be hit by the opposite extreme of drought and precipitation decreases. The impacts to the cryosphere, so permafrost and land and sea ice cover, will be significant, and sea level rise is expected to be between 0.6 and 1 meters by 2100 in a high emissions scenario, threatening coastal areas and potentially areas of high agricultural potential. Two things that the assessment report introduced were shared socioeconomic pathways, so introducing socioeconomic aspects to the representative concentration pathways in the fifth assessment report. And it also showed that there's almost a linear increase between emissions and global temperature rises. Next slide, please. So, here we go. So another thing that the sixth assessment report builds on is providing greater links between predictions at the global level and regional impacts, as well as providing greater understanding around modeling capabilities and physical processes. And the report introduced greater confidence in predictions through the use of and incorporation of physical observations. So just to highlight the link between global changes and regional impacts, that sort of moves us nicely on to the impacts on the African continent. So next slide. Given this increased focus on regional impacts, the sixth assessment report provides an important overview of secondary impacts in Africa, as well as those primary impacts, which we've just looked at. So, for example, in terms of biodiversity, we can no longer see climate change independently of ecosystem destruction. And Africa has several biodiversity hotspots, from the plains of East Africa to the forests of Central and Western Africa to the Cape biotope. And all of these are threatened by rising temperatures. Food production is also expected to be impacted by rising temperatures and changes in the amount and concentration of precipitation, and also on fishing as oceans warm. And another secondary impact is that of public health, as temperature leads to the spread of vectors and vector-borne diseases. Next slide, please. So not only will the impacts be greater, but vulnerabilities will be exposed by climate change impacts. And some of the most vulnerable regions are to be found in Africa. So just to give a few highlights, there's quite a lot on this slide, but just to give a couple of examples, sea levels are rising faster in Africa than the global mean, particularly in the Red Sea and the southwestern Indian Ocean. So this will impact on exposed coastal cities and important agricultural centers such as the Nile Delta. Droughts are also occurring with greater regularity. For example, in the Horn of Africa, there is a drought right now, which is affecting directly around 50 million people in the region. It's the worst in 40 years. And the World Weather Attribution Group has estimated that this drought has been made 100 times more likely by climate change. And rain, when it does come, is often more intense and more concentrated than it would be in a cooler climate. So, for example, in 2020 to 2021, prior to this current drought, severe flooding in South Sudan displaced hundreds of thousands, and this leaves little respite from climate-amplified impacts, which are increasing the severity of droughts and heavy weather events. Next slide, please. So just a couple of other examples, maybe, before I jump to the finance sector. Rising temperatures, as I've briefly mentioned before, are resulting in declines in agricultural productivity. So since the early 1960s, productivity has been down by 34%, and there are expected to be further declines in the future. So, for example, 1.5 temperature rise, which is a pathway that we're not even reaching at the moment with current policies, even that will result potentially in a 20 to 60% decline in wheat yields across southern and northern Africa. One other example would be water resources as well. So increasingly under pressure from a rising population and from rising standards of living, this will be impacted by more frequent droughts and heat events, which will increasingly put strains on water resources. And in the meantime, across the continent, around 800 million people lack access to basic sanitation services, and over half of African countries have inadequate capacity to implement integrated water resource management, according to the World Meteorological Organization. So next slide, please. So clearly the challenges from climate change are enormous, and only compound the already enormous challenge for the continent of ensuring sustainable development and economic growth, which are at the top of the agenda of most governments in the region. And what is the global response to this challenge, particularly in terms of financing and mobilizing financing for emerging markets and developing countries? Well, the climate challenges we're facing include reducing emissions, the burden of which falls largely and understandably to the global north, but emissions are rapidly rising in emerging markets. It must be noted as well that potentially there are huge opportunities from the transition, and in parts of the African continent, the opportunities from scaling climate finance are enormous. I mean, you just have to think of the potential of solar power in Northern Africa, in wind power, in Northwestern Africa and the Horn of Africa. Secondly, we have adaptation, adapting to the inevitable changes in the climate that are already occurring and only expected to increase. And then, of course, we must not forget wider sustainability. Meeting the Sustainable Development Goals is perhaps higher on the agenda for most policymakers in Africa than climate change directly. But of course, climate change will have an inevitable negative effect on governments and communities' ability to achieve those Sustainable Development Goals. But with careful planning and financing around climate change, this could indeed support the achievement of those SDGs. And as you can see from the graph on the right here, actual flows of financing, according to the IMF, are falling far short of the flows required. Next slide, please. There has been some action by governments. So in COP15 in Copenhagen, there were pledges. There was a pledge by developed countries to provide $100 billion per year to developing countries in climate finance. And up to now, that commitment hasn't been met. So we're talking well over 10 years that commitment has not been met. So what are the options for filling this gap? And there are a range of options there. We need to look towards bilateral concessional financing. We need to look towards multilateral concessional financing. And then the DFI system. The DFI system in particular can scale its support to climate action and leverage private financing. But perhaps the biggest area for scaling would be private finance itself, and that's what we're here to discuss today. There is a large untapped level of private finance potentially. And the incentives and disincentives to scale private finance, on the other hand, have to be developed by international actors, such as those bilateral donors, such as those DFIs, and by national policymakers as well. Next slide, please. Yes, so there's a lot of information on this slide. So all that, despite not meeting the $100 billion, there is quite a lot happening. Climate finance is growing rapidly, at the global level at least, though according to the OECD, climate finance provided and mobilized by developed countries focuses largely on mitigation in high-emitting countries. And of course, this is the clear priority right now to reduce and to mitigate climate change as far as possible. But of course, this means that financial flows are not going to those low emitting countries, largely in the African continent, that haven't caused the problem of climate change, but are perhaps going to be heavily affected by it. Public climate financing for developing countries reached $83 billion in 2020, so still not reaching that $100 billion mark, as I've said, though it has grown at around $4.4 billion since 2013, as you can see from this graph on the right. And multilateral development banks have started to shift financing towards climate finance, and this has risen year on year by 24% from 2020 to 2021. So that really has started to accelerate in the last couple of years. And almost all MDBs have set post-2020 climate finance targets. And indeed, some banks have gone quite far with that. So the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, for example, which provides financing to Northern Africa in this context, is committed to providing over 50% of their portfolio to climate finance within the next 3 years. On the private finance side, but also supported by multilateral development banks, there are a number of innovative finance instruments that have accelerated. So, for example, according to the Climate Bonds Initiative, GSS plus bonds such as green, social, sustainability linked and transition bonds have reached a global volume of almost $1 trillion in 2021, down from a peak of over 1 trillion in 2021. And blended finance is increasingly becoming part of that conversation to leverage private finance with the support of concessional financial instruments. And that has been called for both mitigation and adaptation objectives. Just one last thing is that the table in the middle does give examples of possible revenue-raising approaches for climate action by policymakers, such as taxing global financial transactions, raising carbon pricing, and ending fossil fuel subsidies worldwide. Of course, the latter is politically tricky. Next slide, please. On the private finance side, sustainable finance from the private sector has also grown over the past years, with SDG-related funding reaching $2.5 trillion in 2021, according to the Force for Good report supported by UNCTAD and the finance sector. And this is supported by sustainability funds, which have reached around 250 new offerings in the course of 2021. And this is not only directed to developed countries. Around 10% of that finance is going towards emerging markets and developing countries. But of course, there are a number of barriers to scaling that, and that needs to be addressed by multilateral development banks and policymakers. So despite this growth, we are far from achieving the scaling of sustainable and climate finance. And as you can see from the graph on the right from the World Resources Institute, acceleration is really needed to leverage private finance for climate objectives. Next slide, please. So that said, international and regional standards have emerged and continue to develop, building on the work of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, who published their recommendations in 2017. And based on that and the work of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, as well as the International Integrated Reporting Council, the IFRS formed the International Sustainability Standards Board in 2021 to develop an international standard for sustainability and climate-related disclosures. And they published their draft standards last year. And following extensive consultation, they are expected to release those standards in their final form this June. And potentially that will have an impact given the reach of the IFRS worldwide. The work of the TCFD, which was the first framework really to request firms to report on the impacts of climate change on firms, so a sort of outside-in perspective, rather than firms' impact on climate and environment, which previous reporting frameworks had done, so an inside-out approach. And so this framing, for the first time, made firms look at climate change and consider the risks from climate change, and also to identify what could be the opportunities for their business. So this was only a voluntary framework, and in many jurisdictions now, there is very intense and active work on translating that into regulations and supervisory expectations. So there are examples here from the EU, the US, and the UK. But I won't go into those in much detail now. So next slide. And beyond that, of course, climate risk disclosure will only get you so far. It only sort of signals to the market what potentially, and well, if those disclosures are comprehensive and transparent enough. But what do you actually do about channeling financing towards managing those risks in a positive way? So what some jurisdictions, such as the UK and the EU, have done is to put together, in the UK here, we have the Transition Plan Task Force, which was initiated by the government to look at how firms can put together templates and guidance for setting metrics and targets towards a Paris-aligned transition pathway. The work of that Transition Plan Task Force is ongoing, and hopefully will be translated into mandatory regulation. In terms of voluntary initiatives, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero brings together voluntary finance industry-led initiatives for financial institutions to transition to net zero, building on the work of the TCFD and in particular their 2021 reports on metrics, targets, and transition plans. Unipify, just the signal, is the host of 3 of these industry alliances. So the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, bringing together those financial institutions to work towards net zero aligned businesses. Next slide, please. Okay, and perhaps we just skip onto that because I wanted to just focus on Africa now. Okay, so what does this mean for Africa in particular? Next slide, please. We've gone into some of the examples globally that are pushing climate finance regulations, and of course these will have an impact potentially on African financial institutions who operate internationally or are sourcing financing from North America or Europe. But there are also very strong initiatives from Africa, often with the support of international climate finance networks, such as the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS. So just to give a couple of examples, and I won't go into all of them, but in Egypt, for example, the central bank published sustainable finance guidelines in 2021, with the Financial Regulatory Authority requiring ESG disclosures of publicly listed companies. And Unipify does quite a lot of work in Egypt. We have a number of member banks in that country. In Kenya, where we've also done some training and capacity building, the 2016 Climate Change Act, passed by the Parliament in 2016, provides a regulatory framework for climate disclosures and climate finance. And the Central Bank of Kenya released guidance to support that framework in October 2021. Next slide, please. There's also work, and I did unfortunately skip over Morocco there, but there is quite a bit of action in the Maghreb. So also in Tunisia, the Financial Market Council and the Stock Exchange in Tunis created an ESG reporting guide in 2022, providing concrete guidance on standardized disclosures. In Africa's largest economy, so turning to West Africa, Financial institutions are required to report every 6 months in line with the Nigeria Sustainable Banking Principles, and that is mandatory for all banks. And in Mauritius, so an example of a small island developing state, the central bank have launched the Climate Change Centre in 2021 after joining the Network for Greening the Financial System. And they've published guidelines on climate-related and environmental financial risk management last year. So financial institutions will be required from this year to submit internal frameworks and roadmaps every 6 months to the Central Bank of Mauritius to address climate-related and environmental financial risks. And of course, these are not exhaustive examples. There is a lot of work also going along in many countries. I didn't mention Southern Africa, but of course there is work going on there, in South Africa, in Botswana, and in many other countries. Next slide, please. Climate finance needs vary greatly depending on regions. This study from the Climate Policy Initiative shows the needs of the various regions of Africa. These figures do vary widely, but perhaps we have to take into account that perhaps government approaches to accounting for and identifying climate-related financing may vary between jurisdictions, and this of course would be reflected in their nationally determined contributions as part of the UNFCCC framework. It can be seen here that adaptation needs are estimated to be somewhat lower than mitigation needs. Of course, this follows the global trend of the balance between mitigation and adaptation financing needs. But for me, when first seeing this, was quite surprising because of the vulnerability of Africa to climate change and the needs to adapt to climate change in the continent. But of course, what is material is to create a low carbon emissions economy, and perhaps that's the initial focus of these nationally determined contributions. It must also be noticed that these figures do not take into account loss in damage. So in other words, the harms inflicted by climate change that go beyond what people can adapt to. This was introduced to the UNFCCC framework at the last COP in Sharm el-Sheikh at the end of last year, but a mechanism for calculating loss and damage and for financing have not yet been put into place. Next slide, please. So transition financing needs in Africa are considerable, of course. Around 80% of Africa's electricity generation comes from fossil fuels, and yet only 2% of the world's renewable energy investment went to Africa. And as can be seen from the graph on the right from the International Energy Agency, energy sector investment in the continent has actually dropped since 2014. And this shows that there is this transition in the way that international financial flows are going. So flows to oil and gas projects, for example, have dropped, but these are not being replaced by commensurate rises in investments for renewable energy. And IRENA have identified some of the keys to financing transition in Africa, so supporting renewable energy capacity, de-risking international financial institutions so that they can overcome some of the barriers to ensuring bankability for renewable energy projects, policy prioritization of renewable energies over fossil fuels in the continent, as well as looking at sectors beyond electricity generation, such as transport, cooking, heating, and cooling. Next slide, please. And something that is very pertinent for my colleagues from the bank and from the Global Centre today is the climate adaptation aspect. So climate adaptation financing falls well short, according to the Global Centre on Adaptation's estimates, and this gap needs to be filled both by public and by private sector finance. So this covers both adapted investments and adaptation enabling investments, and public finance and impact investors. So quite a niche part of the private finance environment ecosystem have been involved in developing this. But developing adaptation frameworks for more mainstream financial institutions is somewhat lacking so far. But this is what, and I will go into this a little bit in a couple of minutes, this is what UNIPFI are trying to do with our banking members, and also the Global Center on Adaptation and the African Development Bank are doing through the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, the high-level framework for which you can see here on the right-hand side. I know I'm just coming to the half-hour mark, so I should probably just go through what UNIPFI are doing. So next slide, please, Marina. And next slide again. So UNIPFI is a network of well over 500 financial institutions covering insurance and banking. We cover around 50% of global banking assets, so we're quite a strong platform for scaling climate and sustainable finance. And this includes 23 banks from the continent, as well as 11 insurers. And in terms of climate finance, we're working across what I've called here 3 pillars, but really 4 pillars. So knowledge and research, climate risk, decarbonization, and adaptation. Next slide, please. In terms of knowledge and research, we've developed quite a lot of work, particularly in Northern Africa through the SDG Climate Facility Project, which is a multi-stakeholder project with the League of Arab States. So we've assessed the landscape of climate and sustainable finance in the region. We've also worked with policymakers and financial institutions in Egypt and Morocco to identify how we can unlock new approaches to financing adaptation in North Africa, as well as looking at what financial institutions are currently doing to scale private sector finance. And across the continent, we've partnered with the bank here and the Global Center to look at how climate risk regulation is being scaled across the continent. Next slide, please. In terms of climate risks, we have a very comprehensive set of courses, and any participants on the webinar today would urge you to look at our website. We have online courses for individuals and institutions. We also have a climate risk program where we have participants at the institutional level to look at some of the cutting edge areas of climate risk. So some examples I give here are around physical risk, around practices at the regional level, the sector level, and stress testing, just to give a few examples. And then we also provide bespoke courses for regions or countries. And I'll just give a couple of the examples that we've done here for Tunisia, for Egypt, and for Kenya. Next slide, please. In terms of emissions reductions, probably the flagship program we have for banks is the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And we have over 40% of global assets on that alliance, including 3 banks from the African continent. And this requires banks to set targets for 2050 to reach net zero emissions across their loan book, with intermediate targets focused initially on 2030 and thereafter 5-year targets. And that requires those banks to annually publish absolute emissions and emissions intensity in line with best practice. But we'll go into that more in the second webinar with my colleague Sarah from the Banking Alliance. Next slide, please. We've also done research to help banks in the Middle East and North Africa region in particular to help drive decarbonization. We have one bank in Egypt that is signed up to the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and we want to help them deliver on that, but also bring more banks towards climate action. We've also looked at how Islamic financial institutions can start to develop climate action and climate finance. And we are supporting banks across Africa as well as 2 other regions by setting up regional hubs to support the net zero alliances. And the next slide, and I think that's my final one, and apologies for taking 5 more minutes. Finally, of course, the other side of the coin of managing the climate impacts will be, how do we respond to the physical impacts of climate change? And of course, we had requests last year from our banking board to look at this more closely. And I think that comes from our global banking membership, where we have banks in regions that are perhaps more exposed to the physical impacts of climate change than to transition policies, or banks that operate in sectors that are more exposed, such as real estate, real assets, or agriculture and forestry. So this March, we launched a working group on climate adaptation, and this aims to build on some of the research that we conducted last year and can be found in this report, Adapting to a New Climate. On the insurance side, we're also supporting the development of resilient approaches to investment in MSMEs by providing sustainable and climate-linked insurance for those companies. So I think that's pretty much my presentation. Over to you, Marina, and apologies for taking so much time.
No problem at all, Paul, and thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. And we have a lot of questions on the Q&A, so we will take some of them, and we'll also give the opportunity to participants to ask questions directly. So let's start with some questions on the Q&A. So first question, as part of the climate change mitigation approach, what are your thoughts regarding support for oil and gas projects in Africa?
Yeah, clearly this is a quite a delicate subject, and of course my colleague from the Net Zero Banking Alliance will probably go into this in more detail about how this applies for financial institutions in regions where emissions are far lower than the global budget. I think this really responds to, first of all, you have to look at the global budget, and we're very close to reaching that budget. But on the other hand, financing from countries where that budget has not been reached at the national level perhaps have more leeway, and this has to be regarded from the framework of the UNFCCC. But I can't give a comprehensive answer on that because I don't want to contradict what my colleague from the Net Zero Banking Alliance might say next week, and how that might work for jurisdictions in Africa. I mean, what is absolutely crucial, as you have seen, is that number one, financing for fossil fuel related projects will become more expensive as multilateral development banks start to focus away from carbon intensive financing. Also, increasingly large mainstream financial institutions will also start to pivot away from financing major fossil fuel projects. So the capital costs of those projects will increase over time. The question then is, will renewable energy financing increase commensurately? And that is what we're trying to do through the Net Zero Alliances and the international framework for financing through multilateral development banks, etc., is also trying to address.
Thank you, Paul. Another question. After the failure to mobilize $100 billion per year, what needs to change in the global strategy to successfully mobilize trillions of dollars needed to address climate change? In other terms, what do you suggest as solution to mobilize more money for climate action, especially in Africa?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very complex problem. I think that the $100 billion per year problem is simply is more of a question of willingness by the OECD countries to mobilize that finance. But of course, even the $100 billion, as I've said, will not be enough to meet the financing gap, both for emissions reductions, for low carbon investments, and also for climate adaptation. So we need to think a bit more laterally about how to scale this financing. I focus largely on adaptation and physical risks. And what we've seen in terms of climate adaptation is that, first of all, and recent study from the LSE Grantham Institute has highlighted this, that there is possibly quite a lot of adaptation that is ongoing by private enterprises and by private financial institutions that is simply not being monitored or covered. So first of all, we need a better approach to identifying and measuring financing for adaptation. And that is what the work of our adaptation working group under the Principles for Responsible Banking will try to do over the coming months. Currently, there's a lot of adaptation metrics approaches, which are largely led by development institutions such as MDBs and development agencies, and from the private finance side by impact investors. But it's very probable that these frameworks will not work that well for more mainstream financial institutions. So that needs to be improved as well. How can we identify what is adaptation? And then also the costs of investing in adaptation can be quite high. So the costs of identifying those projects, of measuring whether they are adaptation or not and how much impact they will have, can be very tricky. And employing experts to conduct those measurements and to identify those projects, of course, adds transaction costs. Not only that, but we know that in countries that are not of investment grade, the costs of investment are that much higher. So we need the international financing framework, so multilateral development banks, bilateral and multilateral donors. We need to adjust that framework so that it helps private investors to reduce their exposure to those risks in emerging markets and developing countries, and can therefore leverage the private financing needed. Also, the kind of tools and financial instruments available need to be scaled. So, for example, looking at blended finance, looking at sustainability and climate-linked credit lines for banks, which UNIPFI are aiming to look at with our PRB working group and with a working group of DFIs that we have. We'll be looking at this. And then we are working very closely with the V20 group of countries to look at how insurance can be used as a lever for scaling greater financing for adaptation. I hope that is comprehensive enough. I mean, I know my specialism is on adaptation, and I haven't gone in too much into the decarbonization financing there, so apologies for that, but I'm hoping my colleagues in the subsequent webinars will be able to answer to that.
Yes, speaking of that, one very interesting and important point coming out from your presentation, and also mentioned by Professor Nyong at the beginning of the session, is the importance to have an African voice to address these issues and to actually attract investment in Africa. So you mentioned the work done by UNEP-FI, and the Aflac initiative is one of these important it's one important initiative to actually address this issue. So I will suggest to have the presentation of the Aflac initiative now with David, and then we can go back to the Q&A session, both on Paul's presentation and also on the Aflac initiative after David's presentation. Thank you very much, Paul. David, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Marina, and also thanks, Paul, for the very interesting presentation, and also obviously to all the participants for the questions. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk to you about AFAC, AFAC being the African Financial Alliance on Climate Change. My presentation will cover what AFAC is, why AFAC, and what we are aiming to do through AFAC. As Professor Nyong mentioned in his introductory remarks, AFAC was launched by the African Development Bank in 2018. And what we've been doing in the past few months is trying to develop a new strategy for AFAC, which we will be launching later this year, as you see in the course of the presentation. So AFAC's vision is to mobilize financial capital and the financial sector in Africa, basically, to support the Paris Agreement goal to make financial flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and the climate resilient development on Africa. What we're aiming to do really through AFAC is to transform the African financial sector to ensure that it is resilient to climate risks, while sustainably meeting the needs of its growing population. Can I have the next slide, please? And I think the important thing there is we're looking at taking care of the risks, but also building the opportunities and having as our headline objective Africa's overall development. Now, how do we aim to do this, or what do we mean by this? We've done quite a bit of research, talked to a number of financial sector stakeholders across sectors, but also importantly across the private sector. So private financial institutions, banks, and other categories. But we've also done quite a bit of work with the public sector side. So in terms of the regulators, the supervisors, the policymakers, etc. And we've come up with 5 areas where we think AFAC needs to focus, or where there are gaps that AFAC can fill. The first one is all about leadership and awareness. And leadership and awareness at 2 levels. First level is ensuring that the African financial sector, both public and private, as I've said, so all African financial sector stakeholders are aware of the climate change risks and also opportunities to their economies. And I think this is important, because if you're not aware of the risks or the opportunities, you can't really do anything about them. So it is, the first is raising awareness. And within that, we also have a leadership and advocacy role. So through initiatives like this webinar series and other capacity building, to raise the level of awareness and knowledge around the risks of opportunities climate change poses for African economies, and particularly the financial sector. I think the second part of that leadership and awareness pillar is really around, and I think some of this has come up in some of the questions I've seen on the chat. I think Paul presented or spoke about a number of international initiatives, TCFD, UNEP-FI itself, Network for Greening of Financial Systems, etc., etc. And I think one of the things that we realized in our research was that there's insufficient African participation in these initiatives. And the issue here is what? The issue is that, and I saw a question which I thought was interesting in the chat about whether, sorry, TCFD was going to become compulsory. The point is, we realized that there's very little, there's insufficient African voice in the international discussions around climate finance. And the assumption is that the African financial sector is not aware of the risks and opportunities around climate change, and possibly B, they're not doing anything about it. Well, our research tells us different. And I think the advocacy here that needs to be done at the international level is ensuring that Africa has a voice in these discussions around setting of standards, taxonomies, regulation, etc., Why? Because if we don't, there's a significant risk that the climate story becomes another barrier to Africa accessing the finance it needs for its development. So that's the leadership and awareness pillar. Second pillar is around access to data. And again, there was a question around this in the chat. We want to work with the African financial sector to ensure that they have access to comprehensive and comparable climate-related data. Why? Because it's the first step in understanding and analyzing the risks, and actually even deciding, what qualifies as climate finance. So all that work around taxonomies, making sure that when we say climate finance, we are all on the same page, we're talking about the same thing, that kind of work. Third point is around climate risk regulation, which is creating an enabling policy environment to ensure that climate risk management is mainstreamed into financial sector operations. So this is mainly around working with the supervisors, but also the supervised entities, both domestically on the continent to ensure that they are crafting regulations which are adapted and which help our financial institutions integrate climate risks in the African context into their decision-making processes, but also making sure, and this goes back to the point I was making about advocacy under leadership and awareness, making sure that those discussions are fed through to the international discussions so that Africa's needs and Africa's specificities are taken into account in the global regulations which are emerging and which will continue to emerge. Climate risk management is all about building capacity to address climate risks and vulnerabilities in decision making. So closely linked to the regulation point, it's all very well having the regulation, but people need to have the tools, the data, and the capacities to actually identify and manage not only the risks, but also the opportunities around climate change. The fifth pillar is all about driving finance towards Africa's sustainable development. And you notice there that we emphasize Sorry, I muted myself by mistake there. So it's all about driving finance towards Africa's sustainable development. And you notice there that we use the term sustainable development because we think, there are issues around the energy transition, some of which we've touched upon. So we think Africa merits a nuanced and differentiated treatment in this context. Next slide, please. So why Aflac? I think there are three, if you like, USPs around Aflac. The first thing, what we're trying to do around with Aflac is actually to create a platform that is owned and led by the African financial sector, that convenes the African financial sector to better understand climate change, both in terms of risks and opportunities, and decide what is important for them. So it is not a case of us dictating to the African financial sector and saying, you have to do this, you have to do that. It is, this is the information that is out there. Tell us what you need to do. Tell us how we can support you to better understand the risks and opportunities around climate finance, to manage the risks and to take full advantage of the opportunities in support of Africa's sustainable development. Second is a knowledge sharing structure that facilitates partnerships and allows institutions to share ideas, best practices, and expertise. As you see in the coming slides, we are partnering with a wide range of partners. GCA, the Global Center on Adaptation, has already been mentioned. UNEP-FI is obviously working with us through this webinar and other initiatives. And we are talking to other players like the Global Financial Alliance on Net Zero GFANZ, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is not to say, I think there are two ideas. A, to avoid duplication. So maximize the impact of the work, the great work that everyone around the table is doing. And two, look at some of the work that is being done at the global level and looking at how we adapt it to the African African context. The third is to have a central structure which allows us to achieve synergies between the initiatives active in the region. I saw a question in the chat earlier which was saying, you know, there are so many initiatives. How do I know which is best for me, and how do I access them? And I think part of Aflac's mission is to be that one point of contact. Can I have the next slide, please? So what are we looking at in terms of structure? So we're looking, as I say, we are looking at a stakeholder-owned, and this is very important to us, an initiative or a platform that is owned and led by the African financial sector. So the structure we are looking at is having sort of working groups or sector networks built around banking, insurance, capital markets, and institutional investors. Each of these will be chaired by a representative from the African financial sector. So, you know, banking, we would have a bank, insurance, we would have an insurer, et cetera, et cetera. And each working group would define their work plan aligned with the 5 areas that I mentioned earlier. We have a secretariat which is hosted by the AFDB. What we do is we will coordinate the day-to-day operations. So we are hosted by the AFD, but we are also supported by GCA there. And then at the global level, at the strategic level, in terms of the steering committee, as I said, this is an initiative that we want to be owned and led by the African financial sector. So the steering committee, which, if you like, is the supreme decision-making body, looking at strategy, budgets, et cetera, will be composed of the implementation partners. So, and you have a few of them at the bottom of the slide there that I mentioned earlier, UNEP-FI, GCA. We're also working with FSD Africa, GFANZ, of course, AFDB ourselves. But we would also have the chairs of the sector working groups. Can I have the next slide, please? I think I'll skip this because I've spoken really about the membership. In terms of where we are looking to launch the new strategy of Aflac at Africa Climate Week, which I think is in early September. At the moment, we are doing a lot of outreach to create the steering committee. So talking to banks, financial institutions, industry associations across the continent to get formal validation of the strategy. We hope to establish that steering committee soon, which will lead to the public launch of the strategy. And from September post-launch, we hope to kick off implementation by the sector working groups. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, and that's it. So as Marina said, happy to take any questions specifically on Aflac or contribute to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. We are slightly over time. May I just ask the speaker, David, especially if you're okay to stay a little longer to ask some questions. So now maybe I will give the floor to one of the participants if I can see some hands raised. Franklin Koza, you may unmute yourself and ask your question, please. Franklin Koza, we cannot hear you. I don't know if you're talking. Okay, maybe a technical issue. In that case, Elisa Lyotonen, you may unmute yourself and ask your question. No.
And Marina, whilst we're trying to sort that out, there's a question in the chat that I'd like to answer, if I may.
Go ahead,
It's a question in the slide on steering committee, which is most effective: banks, insurance, capital markets, and/or institutional investors. And I think the answer is all of them. I think all of them are important, and I think all of them are relevant. Historically, I think we have a lot more traction with the banks and insurance, but that's just for historical reasons, because when we started this work, we were looking at the banking sector simply because if you look at the financial sector in Africa, I mean, banks are 80–90% of financial sector assets in Africa. So in terms of the financial sector, they are the biggest. But I think there's also been important progress with the insurance through FSDA and the Nairobi Declaration on Sustainable Insurance. On the capital market side, we are seeing a lot of movement. We're seeing a lot of movement towards development of green bond frameworks, sustainable bond frameworks, regulations, and etc. And also on institutional investors, we are seeing a lot of questions around how do we align? What do we need to do? What are the risks that we are already carrying in our portfolio? So I think, you know, all four pillars are important. All four pillars are moving forward. I think what you will find, though, is that within each pillar, the country systems are at different levels. We have people who are very advanced, and we have people who are beginning. We have people who are halfway, and we have people who are actually just beginning to think about this stuff. And one of the great benefits of Aflac is bringing all these people together to share experiences so that they can learn from each other. That question was from William Schmidt, and I hope I've helped. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Indeed, William Smith has his question, so I guess it's the same question. I will try again to give the floor to one of the participants. Franklin Koza, do you want to try again to unmute yourself and ask your question? Chris Racklin. Chris McLean, do you want to try to unmute yourself and ask your question, please? Or Elisa Lyotonen. Okay, I don't know if it's a general technical issue. So maybe we can take another question in the chat.
Right now we have Willem Eric Schmidt who unmutes himself, so I guess he can speak.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Schmidt.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you very much. I found this presentation extremely useful, but I'm more a practical person. I would like to ask from the panel, which activities are most effective? There's a lot of opportunities, but what activities? Is it more into education? Is it more in food security? Is it more in natural resource management? Is it more in strategy? I'm sure that Dr. David has a lot of experience to share in this respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm actually not a doctor, but thanks for the promotion. It's a good question, but it's also not an easy question to answer, because I think you need a bit of everything. It all starts with education, and then you have to move through to implementation, and that is why Aflac has such a broad range of activities, because people are really at different levels. And I think a big part of the education is raising awareness, getting people to the point where they say, this is an issue, I have to do something about it. And then you move into implementation, which really depends on what the issue is you're trying to solve. I mean, are you looking at a regulation? Are you looking at taxonomies? But I think ultimately, all these things are needed to drive finance towards sustainable development, and in sustainable development, I think we imply climate resilient development. I see a real doctor has his hand up. So Marina, if you don't mind, I'll ask Dr. Nyong to
Yes,
come in.
I was going to end it. Professor Young,
Thank you.
please go ahead. I think maybe you have some insight for us on this. The floor is
Yeah,
yours.
thank you very much, David. Thanks, Marina. I'm not going to answer David's tough question that he has already answered. But let me, Marina, Elisa said some about not just providing a space. A platform is good for Aflac to hear the voices of the continent, and that's exactly what Aflac is doing. Beyond, it's not just a market square, bring people in and count the number. Many initiatives are driven by memberships. Their success stories is based on the number of countries that have signed on. For us on the continent to realize this is really why most of these global initiatives are not being signed on by Africa, because they want to know, what can I do? How should I do it? Not I've signed on to your thing and promise that I'll do it. So Aflac really goes down to working with those institutions. What do you do? How do you factor in climate change into your work? How do you deal with this practically? So these are things that that we will be doing with Aflac. It's not the numbers. You'll be amazed that even the large corporations, the large financial institutions don't really know exactly what the issues are. I was talking to the MD of one of the largest insurance companies in Africa. And he said, look, Anthony, I'm a convert. I'm already there, because we reinsured insurance companies that insured posh estates somewhere. Then there was a drought, the El Nino of 2006, then there was a drought, then there was a fire outbreak, and all those houses were burnt. The insurance companies now came to us because we reinsured them, and we basically sank. If they had known how to factor in premiums in a changing climate, or anticipating such things, that they wouldn't be in the position they are in. Or if they knew that they could have modeled and projected that there would have been a drought, maybe they wouldn't have gone into that event. So it's not the numbers, but how do we build their capacities to do what we want them to do? And that's the difference with Aflac. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Young. I hope that that answers your question. Maybe we can take one last question, and then we will end the session. Just let me check. Mr. Simeon Chachwanamben, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question, please? Okay. So I will just take one from the chat. Okay, there's an interesting question from Asian Tawa. How do the fintech startup working on the continent play a role here in a tough leadership capacity or technical implementation work? What will be the process to, that's another question, what will be the process to join Aflac since we are not specifically mentioned in the Atlas stakeholders? So David, I think that would be the question for you regarding the criteria for members to Aflac. Institutions such as fintech startup are welcome in the initiative, and if yes, what will be the contribution in the process for them to join?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure so there is, as I understand it, there are two questions. Is there one about the role of fintechs in climate change, and then a second one about joining NAFAC?
I think both are related. So the role of
Okay.
fintech in climate change in generally, and if they are also welcome to an initiative such as
Yeah. Okay, so I'll take the second one first. I think, yeah, I mean, fintechs are more than welcome to join AFAC. I think AFAC is African financial sector, and I don't know who asked the question, but we will share my email afterwards, and please feel free to reach out, and we can have that discussion with regard to joining AFAC, and that goes for everybody. That goes for everybody on this webinar. In terms of the role of fintechs, I think absolutely fintechs have a great role to play, and we are already seeing in some of the work we are doing, we're seeing fintechs develop solutions, for example, for agricultural insurance that relate, that help develop agricultural insurance, which obviously is part of, one of the solutions to helping deal with climate change. We're looking at fintechs that are supporting the development of climate smart agriculture. Around we're even seeing fintechs working with us and with others around data. So I think absolutely fintechs have a critical role to play, because if you really look at the issue of expanding the frontiers of finance or expanding financial inclusion in Africa, I think the general consensus is that that is going to be through fintechs and digital finance. And so you cannot have an AFAC without fintechs. Does that make sense?
I think it's perfectly answered the question. Thank you very much, David, and thank you, Paul, for the presentation, and also Antonio, Professor Nyong, for your insight. So as we said at the beginning of the webinar, this is the first one of a series. So you can see on the next slide, displayed now, the upcoming webinars. And I think I saw in the Q&A chat that one question about why are we always focusing on banks and what will be the role of insurance. So in the following webinar, we will focus on different subsectors of the financial sector. The next one in a week will be focused on African bank, and we will have another one beginning of June focusing on the African insurance industry. So you will receive all the information. And I'm sorry that we weren't able to answer all the questions, but what David said is really important. Please feel free to engage with us. If you have questions on the AFAC initiative, the work of UNFI, and regarding the presentation. So you will receive within 72 hours the recording and also the presentation that we use for this webinar. So thank you very much for joining. And if I just want to point at main takeaway, because this webinar tried to answer this important and somehow difficult question: what does the climate change mean for the African financial sector? And I think from the presentation that we had today, the main takeaway is that there is an urgent need for action, especially in Africa, which is more and more vulnerable to the worsening climate change effects. And they are still important mitigation and adaptation financing gaps. But more than financing gaps, they also represent, and here I'm quoting position of investment opportunities, huge investment opportunities for the financial industry to ensure that the commitment regarding climate change will be met in the future. We can observe many trends forward, the increasing volume of financing and also various regulatory initiatives. And in order for the African financial sector to actually take the opportunities, this investment opportunity, the sector needs a support, not only to attract more investment in Africa, especially on the adaptation and not only the transition, but also to make sure that the African voice will be heard in the international debate. And this is why initiatives such as Aflac and also the work of UNEP-FI and various stakeholders are important in it. So I really hope that this webinar was a first step to gather all the various stakeholders around such important initiatives, and that we will have the opportunity to engage more with you to our upcoming webinar and also to our upcoming action. So thank you again for joining us today. And I hope I will see you soon in a week time for the webinar on African banks. And in the meantime, please feel free to reach out to any one of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marina. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Nyong. Have a good day or a good afternoon.